Yoga teachers, are you struggling to sequence a yoga class for beginners? Not sure what poses are actually beginner friendly? In this video, I'll be walking you through my exact method for sequencing a beginner yoga class. We'll do it together, so by the end of this video, you will have a beginner yoga sequence you can teach. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you get notified every single time I post a new video giving yoga teaching tips. The first thing I do when I go to sequence a class is I pick a peak pose. For the sake of our class together, we're going to use the peak pose of supported warrior 3. Now that I know the peak pose, the next thing I do is I list out the 3 key muscles needed in order to do this pose. So what areas of the body need to be stretched or strengthened in order to safely achieve this pose? For supported warrior 3, we've got our hamstrings, our core, and our glutes. The next thing I do is I brain dump all of the yoga poses I can think of that work those body parts. Now, I've already done this to save us a little bit of time together, so I'll just read them off my list for you. So for the hamstrings, I have a reclined hamstring stretch, seated tree or seated head to knee pose, half split, splits, standing split, pyramid pose, standing hand to foot pose, seated forward fold, standing forward fold with yogi toe lock and gorilla. Now, not all of those are necessarily beginner yoga poses, but we were just brain dumping all of the yoga poses we could think of that really targeted the hamstrings. Next is the core. So for the core, I think of balancing tabletop, boat pose, low boat pose, knee to nose and tabletop, knee to nose and downward facing dog, knee to nose and plank pose, plank, side plank, and forearm plank. For the glutes, I think of bridge, single leg bridge, tabletop with bent knee pulses, warrior 3 with hands on the ground, leg swings, chair pose, locust pose, warrior 3, which is our peak pose, so that works perfectly, supine twist, and half lord of the fishes. So now that we've brain dumped all of these poses, this is our guide to know exactly which poses to put in class. It doesn't mean that we'll use all of these poses, but this is just a guide to know what to do. So the first thing I do is I start with the warm-up. I go through this list of poses and I highlight all of the poses that would be appropriate to put in the warm-up section. So I see here reclined hamstring stretch, let's highlight that. Seated head to knee pose, or seated tree as I like to call it. Seated forward folds. What else do I see here? Bridge, leg lift, single leg bridge pose, let's highlight that. Supine twist, let's highlight that as well. So now we have these poses and let's see how we can puzzle piece them together. The warm-up consists of moving the spine in the 6 directions. So who knows the 6 directions of the spine? Flexion, extension, side bending, and twisting. So just in case you didn't know, moving the spine in the 6 directions while stretching and strengthening one of the key muscles. So let's start with this class on our backs in Shavasana. And let's see how we can piece together some of these poses. So poses that are on our backs that we've highlighted are reclined hamstring stretch, bridge, and supine twists. So let's start with our bridge pose. So in bridge pose, how can we move the spine in the 6 directions? So lifting the hips up and down works that flexion and extension motion. Now in our bridge pose, how could we do a side bend or a twist? Is that possible? We could be laying on our backs with our hips on the ground, but lifting our upper body up and tapping from side to side. Now this will stretch our side body and also work our core, which is another one of those poses, another one of those muscles needed for our peak pose. And then twisting, we can do supine twist. So let's see how we can put these poses together. So we can do bridge with breath. Let's do that like 3 times. And then bridge taps, that works that side body in the core. And then bridge with taps, maybe then we do our reclined hamstring stretch in all 3 ways. And then after our reclined hamstring stretch, we need to do our twist. So maybe we do a supine twist. So right there, we've already worked all 3 of our key muscles and moved the spine in the 6 directions. So bridge with breath, bridge taps, reclined hamstring stretch, supine twist. And then we'll just repeat this whole thing on the second side. Repeat second side. Now, since this is a beginner class, in beginner classes, I don't like to do any tricky transitions. I keep the transitions really, really simple. So now it's kind of time to go from laying on the back to seated. Although we actually could add in here a low boat pose with some leg lifts. So let's add that in before we go to seated because that'll also work the core and we're already on the back. So we just finished with our supine twist. We're laying on our backs. Just do some leg lifts and lowers. We can do them alternating, and then we can do them together, and then option to do full boat pose. So we have 3 progressions here. So we can do leg lowers, 1 leg at a time. Then option for students to continue to do that, or option to do both legs at the same time. And then option to go into low boat pose by lifting up the upper body. So you see how we're also doing this in progressions. So somebody could just stay at lifting and lowering the 1 leg at a time. They could lift just both of their legs, hovering right off the ground, or they can lift their upper body up. So we did that in a really nice progression. And after that, that'll always feel good to take the knees to the chest and rock side to side. So now we've done all we can do on our back. It's time to move our way to seated. I like to use super easy transition. So I just have everyone hug the knees into the chest, roll to one side, and then make their way up to a seat. Now we've got a bunch of seated positions that we can do. We could do seated tree. We could do seated forward fold. We can do half lord of the fishes. So let's do seated tree, and I would do that with a strap in beginner, and that would float really easily into our half load of the fishes. So we'll do seated tree with a strap into half lord of the fishes with bottom leg extended because this is beginner. And then we'll repeat this on the second side. Boom. What a nice warm up where we're on our backs and we're moving to seated. Now we'll move into our next section of our tabletop and low lunge poses. I pretty much always start with cat and cow. I just feel like that feels really nice. So we'll do that 5 times here. And now let's go back through our poses and see which poses here that we can highlight that are low lunge, tabletop appropriate poses. Let me unhighlight all of those. Boom. Boom. Okay. So we have half splits. That's a low lunge pose. Let's see what else we got. We got balancing tabletop here. We've got knee to nose in tabletop. We have plank pose, a side plank pose, forearm plank potentially, tabletop with bent leg pulses. Okay, so here's kind of our list of what to put into the class. So this will flow really easily. So we've got cat and cow. Then we can do balancing table, and I would do it in progression. So I would first just start with 1 leg extended behind you, and then option to stay here or lift opposite arm, and then option to crunch in elbow to knee. So you see how in beginners, we're also doing everything in progressions. So depending on the ability of the beginner yoga student, they'll have somewhere to go, a challenge that feels good for them. So we've done balancing table, leg extends behind, option to lift opposite arm, option to crunch it in. From there, it would flow perfectly into our bent knee pulses. And from there, it would flow perfectly of drawing the knee to the nose. So you see how we're literally just taking those highlighted poses and putting them all together. From the knee to the nose, that would be a perfect flow into low lunge, and then perfectly flows into half split. So boom, we've just done our tabletop and low lunge pose section, literally just following the poses that we highlighted. From there, we'll go back to tabletop. Then I always recommend a nice child's pose between sides, actually teaching beginners what child's pose is, how to do it, and that it's their yoga home pose, and then just repeat this on the second side. Now, in this tabletop low lunge section, I always like to teach a piece of the vinyasa. And since this class is calling for us to do plank pose for the core, this would be the perfect class to teach your students how to do the transition of downward facing dog to plank and how to do plank. So we'll teach that next. So you'll teach actually how to do downward facing dog. I recommend downward dog on blocks. So how to do downward facing dog to plank, and I would do this 3 times. So downward dog on blocks to plank on blocks, back and forth 3 times. Super easy. So now we'll go back through our poses and we'll see which ones are standing poses, because that's a section that we're going to go into next. So we've got pyramid pose. That's a standing pose. We've got standing forward fold. That's a standing pose. So those are our 2 so far in here. So again, in beginner, I don't like to do any tricky transitions. So from downward facing dog to plank, I would just have everyone walk their feet to their hands, put their hands on blocks and forward fold, do a half lift, do a forward fold, come all the way up to arms reaching up, and then to mountain pose at the top of the mat. To get to our standing poses, I simply just like to take the hands to the hips and step a leg back. So super accessible transition. So we have pyramid pose that we want to do. So a really nice flow into pyramid pose could be warrior one, into pyramid, into triangle. And I would do exactly just those three poses together, using the blocks in pyramid and triangle, then having them step back to mountain pose and repeat this on the second side. And before we do this, I actually forgot this, I would teach half a sun salutation A. So that is when you're in mountain pose, you reach your arms up, you fold forward, you half lift, you fold again, you reach your arms up, and you come back to mountain pose. So I call that half sun salutation A, and I would teach this with blocks. And that has our forward fold in it that we needed for this peak pose anyway. Our balancing pose we already know is going to be our, there's my bullet, our supported warrior three. So I would do this with blocks just at the top of the mat. I would just instruct the students to take the blocks in front of the feet and do one leg at a time. If you wanted to add an optional challenge, you could have them draw their knee to their nose so that you could have progressions here in your peak pose of warrior three. And now we move into our cool down. So in our cool down, I like to think that we're doing forward folds and back bending. We could even maybe revisit some of those poses that we did at the beginning of class. So I go back to my list and I do the same exact process that we've been doing so far, right? Our list is literally our guide of what poses to put into class. And I see what poses here are forward folds or back bends, that we could easily put into class. So we've got our seated tree pose here. We could go back and do our reclined hamstring stretch. We have our seated forward fold, which we actually haven't done yet. What else do we have here? We have our bridge and our one leg bridge lifts. We have our supine twist and half Lord of the Fishes. So let's go back to a seated position then, and let's add in our seated forward fold because we haven't done that yet. Go back to our half Lord of the Fishes and then lower back down to our back. So the transition would simply be, they're in mountain pose after they just did supported warrior three. I would literally just say, take a seat on your mat. Now in beginner yoga class, I personally think that they don't have to flow. It's okay for them to be a little bit choppy because I don't want to do any tricky transitions. My main focus is on teaching people how to actually do the poses. So in our cool down, we can go into seated forward fold. We can do that with a strap, just folding forward. And then this could be a nice time in that seated forward fold to move the spine in the 6 directions again. So we've folded forward, we've come up. We can just simply add in a side bend here and just a twist. So in our forward fold, twisting in those ways. So we'll side bend and we'll twist. After that, we can move into half Lord of the Fishes again. Lord of the Fishes on both sides. And from there, that's a perfect transition to lower to the back. And we can go back to our bridge pose with the breath. Do that 3 times. And this time, add in single leg bridge. This is a good progression. We can do 3 pulses and then go into our, you can actually do supported warrior 3 on your back, like a reclined warrior 3, which would be nice. So reclined warrior 3. And then I always just love doing at least one hip opener at the end of class. So we can do figure 4, supine figure 4, and then add that twist in right there. Perfect little flow. Bridge with breath, one-legged bridge pulses, reclined warrior 3, supine figure 4, and a twist. We literally have hit all of the things on our list now. Just repeat that second side. And then for an inversion in beginners, the only inversion I really like to do at the end of class is legs up the wall. So we can end it right there, and then Shavasana. So you see how building a beginner yoga class can actually be super easy and super quick once you have the right formula and you follow the process. So I hope that you found this helpful, and now you have a class that you can go out and teach in your next beginner yoga class. So let me know in the comments if you thought this was helpful, and if you're struggling to sequence your own beginner yoga classes, you don't know which poses to put in class, you don't know if your class is hard or if it's good, and you just want some support with sequencing and teaching a beginner yoga class, I invite you to purchase my 8-week beginner yoga curriculum. It is done for you class plans of 8 beginner yoga classes that you can teach on repeat during your regularly scheduled classes or create your own 8-week beginner yoga series.